Hi guys, welcome back to History with Heath, and today we'll be looking at Armenian Zoroastrianism, also known as Arewordik, which means Children of the Sun. So, Armenian Zoroastrianism, if you don't really know, was and is because there are actually some communities that survived into the modern era, and still today there are some few small mountain communities, especially in Turkey, that still follow Armenian Zoroastrianism. But anyway, so Armenian Zoroastrianism is of course the Armenian form of Zoroastrianism that is, of course, known by many as Armenian paganism, which I don't like, because these people say that, oh no, it wasn't Armenian Zoroastrianism, it was Armenian paganism that just absorbed Zoroastrian stuff. Well, no, it was Zoroastrianism that absorbed local elements. They replaced traditional Iranian Yazitis with their own unique Armenian ones, and reworked lots of terms, as I'll come on to later. Anyway, so let's just go on to the origins of Zoroastrianism in Armenia. So, Zoroastrianism entered Armenia during the Achaemenid Persian conquest in the 5th century BCE, and would of course remain influential for centuries after, especially in the Parthian era. And Armenia is known as the first country to adopt Christianity in 301. But before then, and still under the first early Christian rulers, it was mainly Zoroastrianism, although, like I said, it absorbed many Armenian elements, which included Hellenistic elements, Indo-European kind of elements, and Scythian elements, and also just, some unique, just standard Armenian found elements that didn't come from anywhere else. And this led to lots of syncretism, of course. Well, and even though I say that, what I mean is not, oh, I'm a Zoroastrianism, you're a Scythian pagan. Let's combine our faiths. No, it was, I'm a Zoroastrianism, your Scythian gods are nice. Now they're Yazitis. And also, if you don't really know, I have covered this in my previous Zoroastrianism video, which got lots of views, by the way. That's my most viewed video. But in that previous video, I did talk about the Yazitis, and Zoroastrianism is a monotheistic religion. But they have these things called Yazitis, which are like gods, and you can worship them, you can praise them. It's not like with Catholicism where there's saints that you can pray to, but you don't worship them. No, Yazitis, you can fully worship them, devote your life to them, pray to them, give them offerings, all that kind of stuff. But then there's Ahura Mazda, and one thing to note is this doesn't mean that Ahura Mazda is the supreme god, and like the Yazitis are like secondary gods. The thing is, this is where Western terminology gets a bit skew-iff. Zoroastrianism is a monotheistic religion. I will say that there are some sects like Geomonotheism which did change things a bit, but Zoroastrianism is monotheistic. And the Yazitis, you can worship them, but they're not. They're God. Ahura Mazda is a god, and the Yazita is also God, but not the same kind of God. And what the Western knowledge of God is what Ahura Mazda is. Like, what we would know as gods, as Westerners, that's what Ahura Mazda is. And then these Yazitis are also gods, like a subsect of gods that are below him. So it's still monotheistic. But it just doesn't seem that in a way. Anyway, so who are the actual Arewordiks, the followers of Arewordik? So the Arewordik people, the word Arewordik means children of the sun, and of course are the Armenian Zoroastrians, who were not just Armenian Zoroastrians, they were more of an ethno-religious sect that, of course, preserved the Zoroastrian traditions, but as Armenian. And as you've already probably deciphered, sun veneration is a central ritual of the Arewordiks. They, of course, preserved Armenian. Like, one thing to know is that Arewordik is Armenian Zoroastrianism. Like, they're the same thing. Arewordik is just the Armenian term. And they had Armenian Zoroastrians had no temples and they just relied on oral prayer and household rituals, and especially during times of suppression. And one thing to note is that I have been, like I said, I have been referring to the Armenian Zoroastrians in the present tense, and that's because they still exist in many remote Armenian and Anatolian, because of course what we know as Armenia today is a very bit skew from there's many Armenians who live in Anatolia, Turkey, and the majority of the Zoroastrian community survived in Turkey, not because Turkey's Muslim, but because of course back in those days these parts of Turkey were part of the Christian Armenia, but it's just because Anatolia is more mountainous, it was able to survive there, and we know of, like, this isn't just some fringe theory, we know of communities that survived all the way up all the way up to modern times, 20th century. Like in World War II, I'm pretty sure they found some Zoroastrians in the mountains, the Allies, or the Axis. I'll look into that later. But there also are some communities that survive today that we don't necessarily know of, but we have a good idea that there probably are some mountainous communities. I've already gone over some core beliefs of Armenian Zoroastrianism, but let's just go over let's just go over that again in a bit of a more deeper way. So of course we've got the solar emphasis. Well, of course, mainstream Zoroastrianism venerates fire and light, and the Armenian Zoroastrians take this further and worship the sun itself. And that's of course why they're called the Arewordik, children of the sun. And of course, there's Zoroastrian, so they have the moral triad of Zoroastrian, which is good thoughts, good words, good deeds. And they, of course, blended it with Armenian heroic traditions. And of course, we got syncretism. Armenian Zoroastrianism was never purely Iranian, of course. It merged it just got Armenian deities and turned them into the Azatas and other things like solar cults. So the main gods in Armenian Zoroastrianism are Arewordik. So for the 12, we've got Ahura Mazda, who is known in Armenian Zoroastrianism as Adamazd. Then there's Anahit, who is the goddess of fertility, healing, and water. She is a Yazata. And there's Mir, who you may know as Mithra, who is the god of covenants, light, sun, and is central to Arewordik identity. There's Vahagan, which is the god of fire, war, heroic strength, just very Armenian in characteristics. Okay, so now we're going to get on to the next section, which is mainly around, how Armenian Zoroastrianism differs from mainstream Zoroastrianism. Like I said, it's not just Armenian paganism, it's still Zoroastrianism. But let's just talk about the blend, this identity. So, of course, we've got this strong indigenous layer, because even though Zoroastrianism is not indigenous to Armenia, it almost became indigenous, adopted, as it's syncretized with local Armenian traditions, and, of course, became Armenian Zoroastrianism, not just Zoroastrianism. It went from being just Zoroastrianism in Armenia to being Armenian Zoroastrianism. And another thing to talk about is they had no fire temples, and this is partially due to suppression by Christians, but this was also an early thing they had. They only had domestic rituals, oral prayers, and secret rites, and this added to it, because Zoroastrianism is already very esoteric, but Arewordik adds an extra layer onto that, especially due to its, mountainous, mystical nature, with these secret rites. And if you wanted to know, Armenians call Zoroaster, okay, I might pronounce this wrong, they call Zoroaster Zadast, and they call the Magi the Mok. And this shows the deep integration into Armenian culture. Now let's talk about the survival into the modern era. Despite, of course, Christianization and later Islamation in, of course, Turkey and Armenians in Azerbaijan, Iran, despite that, the documented surviving community included Edessa, Melzifon, and Mardin, which is also just the Diyarbakir region. Edessa survived until the late medieval period, Merzifon into the early 20th century, and I believe that's the one that was found by during World War One. I think maybe World War Two. Then Mardin survived until Islamation by the Ottomans. So that's kind of I would say 1550 something, maybe around there. And the reason why they survived, of course, is the geographic isolation. Like I said, these remote communities, and they have these strong oral traditions, and of course syncretism with Christian customs, making them all blending in. And the main reason why they disappeared, as I mentioned earlier, is of course the forced Islamization, and there's also the lesser-known massacres of Timur in the 1400s, and the Armenian genocide. So I was right, yes, it is World War II. The Armenian genocide, well, around that time, which survived the last known Arewordik community in Mezfon. And by the early 20th century, the Arewordik were effectively extinct as a community. And you might be like, Heath, why are you still calling them presidents? Well, this is more a theory. Because, of course, like I said, the evidence of them surviving into the modern era is not a theory that is proven by records. But I still have a theory that there's probably some communities that still survive, especially in remote Turkey. I'm looking at Turkey, maybe northern Iran. And one of the main ways of course, earlier I pointed out how they managed to syncretize, and of course most people talk about how Armenian Christianity absorbs Zoroastrian elements, like Armenian words for God, feasts, preserved fire jumping, and Armenian church structures, echo Zoroastrian layouts. But we also forget about how Armenian Zoroastrianism absorbed Christian elements. It's like the reverse process. And of course, this was mainly the groups that survived a lot longer. So, the survival is, like I said, it's due to this geographic isolation, and also the fact that they stayed as one community. They lived among Armenians, married Armenians, spoke Armenian, stayed in their village, didn't leave, mainly. And Christianity was able to also provide this structure that was able to keep them alive, not just so they could survive in secret, but so they could reconvert as, like, sort of, keep their traditions better living with this structure. One of the main ways they syncretized was using Christian saints as masks for Yazdas. And what I don't mean that they turned Yazdas into saints. No, they still worshipped them as Yazdas. They just pretended they were saints. Like Mir was associated with Saint Sargis, Anahit was associated with Mary, and Vahagin was linked to Saint Moas. And like I said, this wasn't conversion, it was more or less just like a camouflage. Of course, fire veneration continued, but candles were lit in a more of a Christian devotional way, and household fire rituals were performed like near crosses. And Arewordik families kept a sun corner, which sounds a bit funny, but that's similar to an Armenian Christian icon corner that you probably know. And like I said, people are probably gonna think that they were just Christian, that Christians that preserved Zoroastrianism. No, if they were Zoroastrian, they just pretended they were Christian. They remained Zoroastrianism. It just looked Christian. It appeared Christian. Of course, Arewordik prayers remained oral, solar focused. They invoked Mir, Alamazad, or just the sun. But they did adopt the Christian rhythm, that morning prayers, Christian phrasing, and Christian gestures like crossing hands and bowing, but they did not adopt Christian theology. Of course, Arewordik families often joined in larger Easter processions, Christmas feasts, St. Sarga's Day, especially St. Sarga's Day, and Vardavar. And you might think, oh, they were just hiding. And yes, they were, but they also did reinterpret Christian festivals. They saw Easter as a celebration of the sun's triumph over winter, and Vardavar as a water purification festival tied to Anahit. And one of the most surprising elements is that they used crosses, not just as a way to hide the faith, but they adopted it. Like, this did help them hide the faith, but they didn't do it just because pretend to be Christians. They adopted the cross as everything. They believed that it represented the four directional cosmogram. It was like a solar symbol, and they would wear crosses and have amulets and just practice. And a way to look at how our later Arewordik would look is just, let's just imagine some sort of like an remote Armenian village in Turkey in the 1800s. Like an Arewordik household would greet the rising sun with a prayer to Mir. They would keep a small flame burning in the hearth. They would celebrate tunes with fire jumping. They would attend church on major feast days. And I light candles before a cross that they saw as a solar emblem. They would invoke Saint Sargis, but actually be invoking Mithra. Bury their dead facing the sunrise, of course, and avoid pork and other impurities that are believed by Zoroastrians. And of course, like I said, to outside they just look like heretical, or partially heretical, eccentric Christians, but they knew themselves that they were Arewordik. And of course, this syncretism is mainly ignored because most people focus on Armenian Christianity and how it absorbs Zoroastrian stuff, but not how the actual Arewordik syncretized with Christianity themselves and managed to survive very late. They were rural, they were secretive, few in number, and the last of them were destroyed sadly in the 1915 genocide. And the reason why we don't really talk about this survival is they were mainly misinterpreted as folk Christians rather than who they actually were, which was more folk crypto-Zoroastrians. And of course, the last Arewordik groups in Merzifon, Sivas, Dersim, Edessa, Mardin survived into the late 19th century and 20th centuries. And the syncretism became even stronger during their last days. And they would still worship the Yazitas as Yazitas, but they would even just rename them to, like, for example, they would pray to Mithra as Mithra. Like, what I mean is they wouldn't just see Saint Sargis as Saint Sargis. They would still see him as Mithra and as a Yazita and as a servant of a Master, but they would just call him Sargis. And the Christian calendar would replace the old Armenian Zoroastrian one. And of course, like I said, the Christian symbols are reinterpreted as solar protective practice. And just at the end of this video, I want to just focus on how the Armenian Zoroastrians, I wouldn't call this a pagan survival into modern times, because I might make a video on this, but people think that the pagans in Europe just completely died out with the Lithuanians of the Sami, because the Sami were only fully converted until the late 1800s, while the Lithuanians were only converted until existed until the late 1600s. But people forget about the Mari in Russia who stayed completely pagan. Some of them would syncretize with Christianity, but when I say the syncretism, this wasn't just Christians absorbing Mari stuff. This was complete direct saying, okay, there's Mari stuff, there's Christian stuff. Let's worship the Christian God alongside the Mari ones. Jesus is just is just a polytheistic God. And this still happens today. They survived into the modern times. No last surviving communities. They were just surviving pretty big and good. Like oh, I am the last pagan. No, all Maoris were basically pagans. There were some that were fully Christian, but most of them were this unique syncretism. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope you've enjoyed my ramblings, and I'll catch you on the next one. This is History with Heath signing out.